We make sure that we get you compliant, we keep you compliant, and if something happens, we have your back. We handle the response to a breach, audit, or investigation, and then we round out the coverage with insurance to protect you financially.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Raving Patients Podcast. As you know, I'm your host, Dr. Len Tao, and today I'm excited to have a podcasting expert. We spoke briefly before we recorded this, and I think she said she's been on 40 plus podcasts, which is a lot of podcasts. I don't think I've been on that many. But today's topic is HIPAA and OSHA compliance. Compliance is a complicated topic, and it's one of many the practices pushed down the priority list as a result. That's what I did as an owner. This podcast is going to be designed to help break compliance down in a simple way and provide a step-by-step guidance to help you address HIPAA and OSHA compliance to protect your patients, your practice, and yourself. So today's guest is Danielle McKinley, who's known as the HIPAA Chick. Danielle, thank you for joining me today on the Raving Patients Podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So why don't you briefly introduce yourself to the people that may not know about you? I know you've been on a lot of podcasts, but some people listening may not know who you are. So just give a breakdown of what you do and how you're helping dentists.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in helping. And as you mentioned, compliance is not an easy topic. It's complicated. So people often ask me, like, why do you do this? Like, how do you make compliance fun? And listen, it's never going to be fun. We can have fun while we're doing it. And so that's really my mission, is to help doctors focus on treating patients and enjoying their personal life, but realizing that, hey, this is a big important part of your practice that, if not addressed, could cause a ton of risk. But the good news is there's a really easy way to tackle it. And if we can have fun in the process, then we're all winning.
Well, that's great. So let's jump right into some of the content we talk about. And I want to lead off with something that we spoke about briefly before we started recording. And that's a question I get a lot. It's a question I discuss at all my seminars, because my seminars are very review focused, is can you talk about compliance when it comes to responding to a review online?
Yeah, so reviews are huge, and reviews are so important because if you're not asking your patients for feedback about their experience with you, then how do you know where you need to coach your team or where you need to make improvements? And how do you continue to grow to keep those patients coming? So I get asked this a lot too. And you can absolutely respond to reviews. It is not a HIPAA violation to respond to the review. The important part about your response is, what are you saying? What word choices are you making? You can't acknowledge the patient. You could say something like, we aim to deliver the best care to patients and love to hear about your experiences. You're not actually acknowledging that they're a patient. You're just, responding to that. And so people, if they're looking at the reviews, can see it. So just be really careful. The number one takeaway here with regard to reviews is do not acknowledge that they're a patient, and do not acknowledge anything related to the treatment or experience in regards to the treatment.
Right. You don't want to release any private or protected information about the treatment they had done. Even if they open the door and say that, you can't reply with that. You can use a generic statement like, if someone says, I had a look, and I always say this, responding to a positive review where you violate HIPAA is not so much of a concern because the patient's happy. They're not going to report you. You're not going to get upset. But if you do it to someone who wrote a negative review in the wrong way, that person could take it to the next level and say, hey, this guy violated my HIPAA because he released information that was not private, that was private. So as a general statement, you can say, the office loves doing these things, or please contact the office because I can't discuss this due to HIPAA. Those are definite things I think you can include in your response.
Yeah, and definitely be careful because, everybody has experienced a customer who had a bad experience or someone who's just in a bad mood, right? So they could be baiting you. So be careful for that. And less is more, especially in the negative reviews.
And I agree 100%. Less is definitely more. I'm not even a fan of responding to most of them, but yes, less is more. 100% so. Thank you for answering that. That was the one big question I had. So let's move on to some other topics. So what's one thing that a practice can do to improve their compliance status?
Yeah, sure. So, I get asked this a lot. So what happens with compliance is we attend a lot of Zoom meetings we were doing for a long time, right? Or we're going to a CE course and we're hearing from an attorney or someone in cyberspace and you're getting all this scary information and you're walking away like, I'm going to lose my practice because I'm not compliant. And that's not helpful, right? So you're hearing all of these things you need to be doing, but what is the takeaway? What do you actually need to do? And that's where I feel like a lot of compliance speakers kind of miss the mark in helping direct you into the right direction. So what is the number one thing you can do? Take a risk assessment. A risk assessment is mandatory. It is Health and Human Services way of forcing you to understand what your compliance health is. And it will provide you with a roadmap of this is where you're not cutting it. These are the things that you need to do to address it to protect your patients, yourself, and your practice. So take a risk assessment.
My next question is similar things. What are some common myths that are about compliance? So one of the things I always assumed was that once you're compliant, you're not. This is a yearly thing you have to do. So what are some common myths about compliance that you want to talk about?
So it's funny because these don't change a lot. Like the top two have been this way for a long time. And one of them you started to lead into, which is I did my policies and procedures back in 2003. Or recently I opened my practice 5 years ago. I created the manual. It's been on the shelf ever since. I'm good to go. What do you mean I'm out of compliance, right? So assuming that your policy and procedure manual is up to date is a really big myth, like just because you have it. So policies and procedures change all the time. Some recent ones were like access rights. So things on how quickly do you have to release information, and there's updates to that. So as the policies and procedures change, you have to be updating that manual in order to stay in that compliance status, right? And a risk assessment helps you identify those changes because HHS.gov is not emailing anyone. They're not doing press releases. They're making it hard on you to figure out those updates. That's the reality. Now, the second myth is going to be around training. So practices will assume that, oh, I attended a CE course. I'm good to go for my annual training. And that is a big mistake because the number one area where breaches come from is human error. So being able to prove that you trained your team, and not only that you trained them with compliant information, but that you tested to make sure they understood what's responsible of them, that's what Health and Human Services is really looking for. So don't assume that if you went to a course and you got a CE certificate, you're good to go on your annual training.
So obviously we run a dental practice. Everything is very busy in the practice and things happen. What, and this is not a question we were talking about, but I came up as I'm speaking with you. What is the most common type of incident that you find happening in a dental practice? Let's say from an OSHA perspective and a HIPAA perspective. What do you see being reported most often?
Yeah, so it's a lot of times from the HIPAA side, it's going to be a complaint that then leads to an investigation. So a team member, leaves a voicemail that they shouldn't have. They send an email to an unintended party because they're super busy and the names were very close in sound, like Danielle McKinley versus Danielle McKinley, right? That's an easy mistake that any of us could make. And then they have to notify both parties. And one party becomes upset, files a complaint with Health and Human Services, and now an investigation is happening. And that's where if they find one thing that's out of compliance, then they're going to go, oh, there's going to be others. So now we have an opportunity to assess some penalties, right? Now, on the OSHA side, it's going to be not maintaining like the SDS sheets or the plans. So it comes down to documentation again. Again, having that mindset of, well, we just had someone in 3 years ago and updated things, so we should be good to go. You need to be reviewing that annually and making the necessary changes.
So you mentioned, and again, things come out of my mouth as I hear them from you. You mentioned that someone called and left a voicemail that they weren't supposed to leave. Can you briefly say what violates HIPAA when you leave a voicemail? What can't you say to somebody?
Sure. So when you're going through, like, let's just use the example of a new patient. In your new patient packet, you're having them tell you how they prefer to be communicated with. They may have said in their paperwork that they don't want detailed voicemails. They only want, to speak to you about results of something. And so if you call them and you don't follow those requests, that's where it's going to come from. You can leave voicemails, hey, this is Danielle with McKinley DDS, and I'm calling in regards to XYZ appointment. Please give us a call back. Or XYZ appointment you recently had and updates regarding it, where you're being vague and asking for that callback instead of delivering all the information on the voicemail.
So you want to be careful not to deliver all the information. You want them to ask you to call you back. And as long as you do that, you're not violating that.
Correct. Unless they've given you permission to leave those detailed voicemails. Then you have the authorization. And that's why it's so important to keep that authorization as part of their record. Because if they change their mind or they became upset for some reason, you now can say, look, this is where you gave me the approval.
So do you recommend when the patient, every time they come in, how do you recommend broaching the subject of HIPAA? Because remember, you can have patients for 10 years and things may have changed and you don't know their feelings change. So is that something that should be discussed with them every time they come in? Hey, do you have any updates to your health history? Do you have any updates to your address or contact information? Do you want to update your HIPAA information as well then? Is that something you should be doing?
Yeah, you can. I mean, it's they need to do it. You don't have to do any overkill here, right? To inundate your front office team. It's really, if they've given you the authorization, it's their job to then revoke that authorization if something has changed. You're not required under HIPAA to revisit that every single time you see the patient.
Gotcha. Okay. So if they don't revoke it or change it, then you're still in compliance with what they originally gave you.
That's correct.
Perfect. I did not know that. So let's say there is an incident, which, I don't know what the percentage is. You would know better than I do, but I'm sure it's not uncommon, but it's not common either. What's the number one thing a practice can do to prepare for an incident?
So the number one thing is going to be to create the emergency and incident response plan. That is a requirement under HIPAA, and that's going to help you get acquainted with the breach notification requirements. This is where practices really get in trouble. So I'll give you an example. We'll use ransomware because that's still rampant, right? It's happening everywhere. It's kind of a matter of when, not necessarily if it's going to happen to you, unfortunately, statistically. So in that scenario, you're going to call your IT provider, right? You're going to expect them to remove the virus, reinstall your applications, get your network back up and running. At that point, their job is done. Under the HIPAA laws, you still need to flush out whether or not information was accessed while the data was being held ransom. Because if it was, then you have to notify patients. You have to provide them with identity theft monitoring and insurance for a certain amount of time. You have all these steps you have to follow. And a lot of practices I talked to today don't realize that responsibility falls on them. So by going through the experience of the emergency and incident response plan, then that's where the education and awareness comes from.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, and I know this relates directly to HIPAA, and especially because I run the dental division for Bird Eye, we are constantly being asked to provide a business associates agreements to the offices. So it's amazing. And most don't ask. It's crazy how many people don't ask for it. We provide it to them and they don't even know what it is. So can you talk about what a business associate agreement is, why it's important to have, what role it plays? Can you go into all that stuff? Because this is a big topic now.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is most of the HIPAA laws are working against you, right? Because they're complicated if you're not doing them. The business associate agreements is working for you. So this is a really cool part of the law because its sole purpose is to protect your practice if a third-party vendor is at cause for an incident. So there's two exchanges that have to happen. Number one, every practice must have their own business associate agreement. So if you're operating under the assumption that, I work with Bird Eye, they've sent me a business associate agreement, so now I'm good, you aren't getting the protection that the agreement is designed to give you. You must have your own. So the covered entity, which is you as the practice, you need to send to your third-party vendors that qualify as a business associate. That's going to be anyone that you're sharing patient information with or that could access patient information. And the intention of the agreement is to say, hey, you're accessing sensitive information at my practice. If something happens to that information by you or your team, you're responsible, not my practice. That's the simple breakdown of what it's designed to do. So if Bird Eye was breached and a practice that uses Bird Eye was caught up in it, as long as that practice can show that they sent Bird Eye a business associate agreement of their own, and then instead of Bird Eye signing it, Bird Eye is giving them the agreement you all have created that can be uploaded and kept on record. Now that exchange is complete and the practice is protected because they weren't at cause for the incident and the exposure.
So I have a question. I want to clarify something you said. So Bird Eye sends an agreement when they sign up to the practice. the practice then has to send something to Bird Eye as well. So there has to be one sent to each.
So think of it as the sender of the agreement is the protected party. So Bird Eye is a business associate by definition under the HIPAA law. They're also required to maintain their own agreement. Their agreement is saying to a practice, hey, we're a vendor that accesses patient information as a result of the service that we provide. We are acknowledging our awareness to the HIPAA laws and agree to do our very best to maintain a HIPAA compliant status. Where a practice's agreement is saying, hey, you're accessing information from my practice. If you cause a breach, you're responsible, not me.
Interesting. So very infrequently do we get practices sending us their HIPAA, their business agreement. We send them one. So that's really not a completed relationship then, in other words.
Correct. So Bird Eye is doing everything by the letter of the law in the sense of the agreement, right? If we're talking about just the business associate agreement. But the practice isn't realizing that that's not actually protecting them. So the takeaway here on business associate agreements, what you should be asking yourself is, do I have my own agreement? When is the last time I've updated it? And have I sent it to all of the vendors I work with that are accessing patient health information or could? And if you can't say yes to all of those, then you have a gap in that area of compliance.
And I'm assuming this is something that you discuss with them when you work with offices.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when we take a practice through a risk assessment, it comes with a live consultation where we really help break down what the results mean, where the deficiencies are that are causing vulnerabilities, and exactly what to do to correct it, like we just talked about with regard to business associate agreements.
That's really great information. So, all right. So what's the number one unnecessary compliance fee practices have that they're rarely aware of?
Oh, this is a good one because everybody loves to save money, right? So that's going to be a PCI fee. So what a lot of practices don't realize is that if you have a credit card breach, it can also be a HIPAA violation. So there's a double liability there. Unlike a retail store where they would only be subject to the payment card industry, a practice can have that double liability. So here's what you can do to find out if this fee exists for your practice today. Pull a recent merchant statement, typically on the last page under all fees or other fees. Look for anything that says PCI compliance, non-receipt of PCI, regulatory fee, security fee. And it's usually going to be about $29. We see it higher and sometimes a little lower, but that's the average per month. When you get PCI compliant, that fee goes away.
Interesting. So what is required of a practice, now that you brought up PCI compliance, what is required of a practice to get PCI compliant then?
3 things. So once a year, you go through a self-assessment questionnaire, and it's all based on how you process cards. Are you saving cards? Are you on a terminal? Do you have web processing? Questions like that. Upon completion and passing, you're issued a certificate of compliance that's then maintained for 1 year. And every quarter, you need to be running vulnerability scans. And if you have those 3 things in place, you're able to prove you're compliant, and therefore that fee would go away.
Interesting. Not something I realized. So let's talk a couple topics. Cyber insurance. What can you tell the listeners and viewers about cyber insurance?
If you don't have it, number 1 takeaway here is you need it. It is the most used insurance policy for sure that I'm seeing. So a couple of things to note that you want to understand is, does your insurance provider give you any guidance for navigating the breach notification laws? Like, is there any support around breach notification and that process? Because it's really time consuming on you. So you have to think about, if you have a breach, you're going to be dealing with revenue loss as well, because you're going to be pulled to navigating those notification laws. So ask your provider, do you offer any support like that? Does it cost extra? Is it included in my plan? You also want to identify how your claims filing process works, because what I've seen is practices have a policy. They're operating under the assumption that, they've got this coverage, an incident happens, and now when they go to file the claim, the insurance provider is saying, show me proof of compliance. And if they're not compliant, they're denying the claim altogether. So they go, compliance status and coverage go hand in hand. So what is very risky is to operate under the assumption that I have $1 million cyber and data breach insurance policy. That'll just take care of me if something happens. That is a huge risk to you personally and to your business.
Gotcha. And then a common thing that I've seen crop up, and I see it in dental forums I'm in, is dentists are dealing with ransomware. So can you touch base a little bit on that and kind of what you can do to prevent it? What do you do if you are hit with a ransomware attack? Kind of go into those topics.
Yeah, certainly. So definitely get with your IT provider in terms of the prevention side of ransomware. You want to make sure that you're operating on systems that are still supported for things like patch updates with regards to your software. You want to make sure if you have remote employees that you're operating from things like a VPN. Patients coming into your practice, you want to separate your internet network. You don't want them accessing the Wi-Fi that is also running your open dental software. So you want to have two, one for patients, one for the practice. Those are some, 3 best practices that you could start with. And then really don't think of it as how can I prevent it? Because ransomware it's so hard to prevent. Flip your mindset to how can I be prepared for when that happens? And doing things like getting compliant, taking a risk assessment, making sure your house is in order for responding to it. You know who's going to do what and who on your team should be responsible for calling the IT and going through the forensics and that sort of thing. So really focus more towards, am I prepared for an incident? Not necessarily, am I preventing one, right?
Gotcha. So I know we really haven't even talked about what you do or how you do it. And I don't want this to be a sales pitch. We've given them enough information. Can you just briefly go into how you help offices? I know you have a product. I think you called it Office Safe 360. Can you talk about what you do with offices, someone who may be interested in getting help, how you help them?
Yeah, we take the burden off of you is the easiest way to put it. So compliance is a necessary part to running your business, but it's not always the most exciting piece of it. And we recognize that. So the Office Safe program is designed to take on as much of the work for you as humanly possible. For the small portion that the law prevents us from doing, we handhold a point person within your practice through those steps. We make sure that we get you compliant, we keep you compliant, and if something happens, we have your back. We handle the response to a breach, audit, or investigation, and then we round out the coverage with insurance to protect you financially.
Gotcha. So do you want to kind of talk about how you differ from somebody who goes in the office? Because I know we touched on this. Somebody who brings in a HIPAA compliance and an OSHA compliance officer or a trainer. They come in the office and they train you. They do a risk assessment. They give you whatever documentation you need. How you differ from something like that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So the number one thing that sets us apart as a solution provider for compliance is that we're a complete solution. So our program is designed, we have a saying that is turn compliance into savings. And what we mean by that is when you're working with, an on-site trainer, they may not necessarily be getting you everything. Like we do PCI compliance as well, for example. So the difference is that you may be working with 3 to 5 vendors today to try and navigate all of these requirements. And what our program is going to do is centralize that into one vendor.
Gotcha. For those who are wondering, how do you compare costs to what you're doing versus what you're going to pay for one of these trainers who comes in and does the on-site stuff?
You will save money. So our intention is like every time you turn around in the dental industry, it's another this, another that. And we recognize that. But this is an important piece of your practice. So everything that we have put together in our complete solution is designed to make it easy to use, not take up a lot of time, and be incredibly affordable.
And that's the key, affordability. So this was great content. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll have you give your contact information and how to find out more about what you do once we do this fun part of the episode, which is the pod decks question. And Danielle chose the hustle, which is about business. So I'm going to, as I explained to Danielle, I'm going to ask some questions. Just answer them as easily as possible. You don't have to go into a huge, long-winded response if you don't want to. But let's start off with this. Describe Mondays for you in one word.
Oh, I love Mondays. So structured.
Structured. So you have a plan for Mondays. because most people have the
Yes.
Monday blues, but you have a plan. Okay, perfect. What do you think will be your legacy when you are done with your current position?
That's a really fun question. I think that what I'm known for today, it will kind of stick through the legacy, is that I'm dependable. When I say I'm going to do something, I deliver on it, and that I helped make a lot of practices simplify compliance. I've worked with thousands already. So that's typically the feedback that I get, and I think that'll stick.
Perfect. So what do you do when things aren't working? Do you have any weird tricks for overcoming roadblocks?
I love roadblocks. And the reason I love roadblocks is because you learn the most from a problem or an issue. And I always ask myself, like, what is this meant to teach me? And I go immediately into problem solving mode. So I don't let it get me down. I don't fester on it. I immediately sit back, really digest it and go, okay, how do we move forward and how do we address it? And what is this going to teach me? That's my favorite question.
Okay. Have you ever turned down a client?
Yes.
And what was the reason why?
The reason why is because I could tell that we weren't going to be a good fit. And so as you go through business, you start to learn, who is the right client for you. And as you do that, the really beautiful thing is that you can avoid situations that aren't a good experience. So everything that we do, we call it ACE, is delivering amazing customer experiences. And that specific customer that I turned down, I recognized early on in the process that they were going to prevent us from doing that just because their expectations did not meet what our program is or what it is designed to do. And therefore, it's okay to say, hey, I really don't think we're a good fit. I'm happy to move forward in the process with you, but I want you to be happy. And based on what I've learned so far, I just don't think we're the right fit for you.
It's like firing a patient. So, it's good. It's a good feeling sometimes. So what distracts you the most every day?
Oh, I would say my son. So there's an app he goes to daycare, and I like to check the app sometimes incessantly, just like, how is he doing? And that's definitely a newer distraction that came about as becoming a mom.
That's awesome. My son's 15, so I don't have that problem as much.
You're past that phase. My son's 3, so
very much self-dependent. So, what has been your most satisfying moment in business?
My most satisfying moment, I would say, is seeing my mentees thrive. So I absolutely love helping people. And when you can see that you can teach someone to do something and you can see them really get excited and do well and be happy and proud about that, it's really rewarding.
That's great. Do you keep a journal and does it help?
Yes. So one of my daily practices, I either do it at night or the morning, depending on how tired I am in the evening, but every single day I journal. And I highly recommend that if you don't journal today, go buy yourself a journal on Amazon right now.
Hey, I got one right here. I keep notes every day on stuff. So I got my journal right in front of me. So I think it's important. And if you do experience a failure, what do you learn from them?
So many things. The thing is if you expect not to fail, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. It's okay to fail. And it's what you do after you fail that matters and that counts. So when I fail, you might need to have a pity party for a moment, but don't let that go on and on and on. Move into, okay, what can I learn from this? What did this teach me? And how can I avoid this same failure in the future?
And last question, what book have you read multiple times and you think is an absolute must read for someone else?
So I am a huge reader. One of the things that I also practice daily is I read 10 pages a day, no matter what. Sometimes I'll read more than that, but no matter what, I'm going to fit in 10 pages. And over the last 2 years, the book that I have read a couple of times is Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty. It's a good one. So if you haven't read it, check it out.
Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty.
Yes.
All right, I'll have to check that out. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking part in those questions. You did a really good job answering them. As we kind of end the podcast, how can people reach out to you? What's the best way for them to reach out? Do you want to offer them an offer to use your services? This is when you can do all those things.
Yeah, sure. So you can connect with me on social media. On Instagram, I'm at the HIPAA Chick. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm going to give you a link you can give to the listeners as a giveaway. So I am offering a free risk assessment to help you kickstart, get to understand your compliance requirements and what that status is. And then also a free on-demand CE course for HIPAA compliance that'll give you an hour and a half credit.
Perfect. So this was awesome. You did a terrific job. I can tell you're a podcast expert because you were like bam, 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 bam with those answers. So great job. Thank you for joining me. Guys, if you like this episode, please share it. Please let your colleagues know about it. If you're interested in learning more about what Danielle's company can do for you, please reach out to her. She sounds like she has an awesome product to really help you get into compliance with OSHA and HIPAA. I appreciate everybody listening. Remember, the episodes come out Friday at 5 a.m. in the morning now. And as always, remember, your reputation matters. Until the next episode, Danielle, thanks for joining me today, and we'll talk to everybody soon.